The message arrived while I was rinsing tea leaves from a chipped mug, my hands still warm from the water and the radio murmuring a gardening show, and when I tapped it open, expecting a reminder about school pickup for my granddaughter or an errand, I heard my son's voice wrapped in a laugh that didn't sound like any laugh he had used with me in years, saying to his wife that the package would be easier to move once the doctor signed, because then there would be fewer questions and they could clear the flat before Christmas without me making a scene, and I stood there over the sink with the suds cooling on my knuckles while he added that I had always kept tidy records, so it shouldn't take long to find the deeds. He called me the package, and in that moment the tiled kitchen that had held birthdays and winter soups and my husband's late-night toast felt like a stage set being struck between scenes, the nails being prized out quietly so no one in the audience noticed. And I listened to him say he would stall me with a story about a clinic referral if necessary, and that he had already spoken to someone at the bank about consolidating accounts, because Mum mixes things up these days and might be relieved to have one card. I didn't drop the phone or cry or smash a plate. I just turned off the tap and dried my hands on the same towel I'd used for years, a towel with a faded border of blue vines that my granddaughter had once traced with a sticky finger when I'd lifted her up to the sink. And I listened again with the same careful patience I used to keep when balancing an annual budget at the school where I had been bursar for 3 decades, because numbers and voices both tell stories if you let them run without interrupting. And Daniel's voice, my Daniel, who used to slide notes under my door asking for 1 more hour on the computer when he was 13, kept going, telling his wife Layla that the will line would keep my sister out of the picture and that if anyone asked they'd say I had wanted to downsize. And then there was a whispering sound like he had covered the microphone and a chuckle, and the message ended with him saying that he would practice the sad face. I took the phone to the table and sat down on the chair that creaks, because when you learn you are a package, it helps to sit, otherwise the house seems to tilt, and I did the most ordinary thing I could think of to keep my hands steady, which was unscrew the cap of the olive oil bottle and wipe the ring of oil from its lip with a bit of kitchen roll, an old habit of mine because I cannot stand a greasy cap, and then I put the phone on the tabletop like a small animal that might run if I looked away, and what I felt was not a single clean emotion, but layers sliding over one another. Confusion and a pinch of shame, and behind that the slow rising of something stubborn that has lived in my spine ever since I buried my husband Tomas and promised myself that no one would need to carry me except in the way we all carry each other. I tell you this the way I would tell a friend over a slow cup of tea, because I need you to understand that I am not a sainted mother or a helpless old woman. I am a 68-year-old widow who can still lift a sack of potting soil onto the balcony and who knows the smell of damp bank envelopes because I once signed 60 paychecks every month and reconciled 7 staff accounts without losing track of a single signature. And even so, I had been letting Daniel do little things lately like change a light bulb and pick up my prescription, because the winter after Tomas died I learned that accepting help is not the same as giving up. Only now I was hearing how my small surrenders were being tallied in someone else's ledger as proof that I could be moved. The house reacted to my shock before my body did. The clock in the hall stopped ticking, or perhaps I just heard its quietness for the first time, and the radiator let out a half-hearted clank that sounded like a man clearing his throat at a church meeting. And the radio in the kitchen, still droning, offered up a caller describing the best compost for strawberries, which was absurdly tender to me because the ordinary world kept on about strawberries while my son was planning how to remove me like an unwanted cupboard. And I found myself walking to the hall and picking up Tomas's old wool cap from the hook because it still holds the faint wool fat smell of him, something human and steady that gave me permission to breathe properly again. I didn't call Daniel. You don't walk into a fire with a watering can if the building has only just caught. You stand back and look for the exit routes. So instead, I took out a spiral notebook from the drawer where I keep the warranties and batteries, and I wrote down, with the calm hand that had once written pay dates and supplier terms, everything I had heard word for word, the odd phrases he used, and the specific mention of a doctor and the bank. And when I had that on paper, I took another page and wrote down what I knew about my affairs, which was that the flat in my name had been purchased before Daniel was born, that Tomas's half had passed to me when he died because of a will we had made 10 years earlier with a solicitor in town, and that my current accounts were separate, with a small savings account for emergencies where I keep the equivalent of 6 months of living expenses, because my father taught me that storms always come when the roof is half fixed. On the table where my tea had cooled, I laid out the papers like a placemat for a meal I didn't want to eat, and in doing so I found something I had not thought about in years. A narrow envelope with the logo of the solicitor's office where Tomas and I had gone the week after Daniel announced his engagement to Layla, because the wedding had made us think about making everything tidy. And inside the envelope there was a typed covering letter and a little blue receipt and, between them, a business card for a woman named Eleanor Marr who had handled our wills at the time, which mattered because people change jobs, but sometimes they don't, and even if they did, a good firm keeps records. I thought of Layla's way of speaking in compliments that felt like napkins, polite and always ready to be folded away again, and of Daniel's habit of glancing at my mailbox when he walked into the building. A glance that I had always read as protective attention, but now began to gather up with the other signs I had overlooked, like how he had suggested switching my account to online-only statements last winter when the postal strikes were making delivery slow, and how Layla had taken my health insurance card to check the copay after my checkup in May and only returned it a week later with an apology about having forgotten it in a different handbag. I am not proud of what happened next, but I am not ashamed either. I pressed play again and listened to my son's voice one more time for the parts one might have leaned away from, and I heard the phrase capacity letter and the word guardianship. Half swallowed as if he knew the microphone shouldn't catch it, and I put my palm flat on the table like I could iron the wrinkles out of this moment, and I remembered a conversation from years ago when I was still working and one of the younger teachers had cried in my office because her mother had been coaxed into signing a deed of gift by a cousin who promised to help with bills, and how I had written the number of the council advice line on a post-it for her and told her very gently to act quickly because documents have clocks inside them. It was nearly lunchtime when I wrapped my scarf around my neck and went outside to clear my head, partly because the balcony geraniums needed deadheading and partly because I knew the concierge would be in the lobby at that hour. And I wanted the normality of signing the parcel book if there was a parcel for me, a little ritual that says you exist and live at this address. But the lobby was quiet except for an old man reading a free newspaper and the concierge nowhere in sight. So I took the long way around the block, passing the bakery where the owner always adds one extra roll to my bag as a joke and the pharmacy where the clerk knows my antihistamine by brand name. And by the time I reached the green where the dog walkers congregate, I had decided I would not confront Daniel until I had something heavy enough to hold in both hands, a fact like a brick. When I came back, there was a thin white envelope in my letterbox with the logo of my GP practice in the corner, and my stomach tightened the way it did when the school auditors used to ask to see a ledger I had already given them. Because I hadn't requested anything, and yet here was something formal, and inside I found a polite letter reminding me of my appointment the following Monday to discuss cognitive screening results, which made the hair on my arms rise because I had not had any cognitive screening. Unless you counted the occasional, "How are you feeling?" from the nurse when she took my blood pressure, and at the bottom of the letter there was a line thanking me for consenting to share information with my nominated representative. A name I only half saw because the page swam for a second, but when I blinked I read it clearly, and it was my son's name, written as if through a fog. I sat down right there on the hall bench and made myself read the letter twice, because confusion is the ally of the person who tries to move you like furniture, and I noticed a detail that many might miss, which was that the address they had on file for me had the right street and wrong flat number, a transposed digit that would send any paper copy to the door below mine if the postman didn't know us personally, which ours did, but sometimes a substitute came on Mondays. And that small mistake suddenly joined hands in my head with Daniel's casual comments about online-only statements and Layla's delays with my insurance card, and I thought of a line I once read in a novel about how theft often starts with tidying. You know how a room changes when you decide to move a piece of furniture, and suddenly you see the dust shadow and the scuff behind it, the way the floorboards remember the weight of what stood there. My life felt like that. As if someone had already made a plan of where to put me and the scuffs were starting to show, and I wanted to accuse and demand and swing the door open to my son's smiling face and say that I had heard everything, but I didn't. Because if they were using my own tidiness against me, then I would use their confidence against them, and the first step would be to pretend not to have heard. I made lunch without tasting it, and afterward I went to the little box that sits on the wardrobe shelf, the one Tomas used to call the ship's strongbox, in a voice that always made me laugh because it was just a shoebox with an elastic band. And inside were odds and ends I had kept out of habit, spare passport photos, the last postcard my sister sent from a seaside town, a key that hadn't fit any lock in 20 years, and at the bottom a folded sheet of paper with a list in Tomas's careful hand of the accounts we had closed when we moved to this flat, which did not matter now except as a reminder that we had always kept lists together, and that somewhere in the flat there was a gray folder with a clear sleeve that held the original copy of our will and the letter from the solicitor. Because I had seen it last spring when I tidied the pantry and put the old tax returns in a different box, and if I could find it now then I would have something to hold. I pulled the pantry stool into the bedroom and reached for the top shelf where we keep the winter quilts folded like sleeping animals, and behind them, dusty as if it had tucked itself away on purpose, was the gray folder. Exactly where I had told myself it would be, and inside was the will, with our signatures and the witness signatures and the solicitor's stamp, and a clause so short and simple that it shocked me anew. That said the flat passed outright to the surviving spouse and afterward would be divided between my child and a small donation to Tomas's community chorus, which meant there was no space in that language for a transfer while I lived unless I agreed, and I remembered the phrase deed of gift, and felt again the heat that had risen in my face when the teacher had sobbed in my office. On the way back to the living room, I bumped the small table by the door and my glasses case fell open and my reading glasses skated across the floor to rest under the radiator. And when I bent to retrieve them, my fingers brushed something taped to the radiator's underside, not thick but crinkly. And I pulled at it and held a small envelope in my hand with my name on it in Tomas's block letters and the dry glue crackling where the tape had aged, and I stood there holding that secret like a match. I didn't want to strike too quickly, because Tomas was not a man of melodrama and he would not have hidden anything without a reason, and when I opened it I found a single key on a brass ring and a note, 6 words, for when they forget who paid. For a minute I could not get breath into my lungs, not in a dramatic way, but in the simple and humiliating way that happens when you have been holding in more air than you knew. And I sank down onto the stool with the key cutting a little half-moon into my palm from the pressure of my grip, and I stared at the key like it might tell me what lock it belonged to, and I whispered into the quiet of the flat, because sometimes speaking steadies your thoughts, that Tomas had left me, without speeches or instructions, a key for a time when someone might forget his part in the making of this life. And I thought of our bank visits and his habit of storing duplicates of important things in safe places, and it came to me that he must have arranged access somewhere independent of anything I had kept, perhaps a safety deposit box or a locker, and that this key might fit more than metal, it might fit the part of the story that was still dark. I placed the key on the table and took a clean page from the notebook and wrote down the phrase from Daniel's message about the doctor and the capacity letter, and I wrote the date on Tomas's note in my hand. There was no date, of course, but I wrote today's date next to the words to anchor them, and I told myself that I would pretend to be as ordinary as bread for the next few days, and that I would let Daniel take me to this invented appointment if that was what he wanted, and that in the meantime, I would visit the bank and the solicitor, and I would ask the concierge tomorrow whether any registered letters had come for me that had been signed by someone else. And I would find out what lock this key opened, because a dead man had left it to me for a reason, and if my son had forgotten who paid, then perhaps he had also forgotten that I used to balance 10 ledgers at once and make the numbers do what they were supposed to. I was still sitting there with the key when there came a gentle knock on my door. Not the pushy rap of a courier or Daniel's cheerful double tap, but a shy little rhythm like someone asking for sugar, and when I opened it I found my neighbor Mira, who lives 3 doors down and works, I thought, somewhere in an office because she leaves in neat trousers with a lanyard, and she stood there with a packet of biscuits and an apologetic smile, and said she had meant to bring these yesterday because Her nephew had baked far too many for a school fundraiser, and she glanced at the envelope stacked on the hall table and the gray folder open next to the key, and the way her eyes flitted told me she had noticed more than she intended to. "Are you all right, Elena?" she asked, her voice that peculiar warm plain tone of people who keep their counsel but step in when the line is near, and when I hesitated she added with a quick, dry humor. "I ask because I heard Daniel in the lobby yesterday saying something about changing your doctor, and I don't mean to pry, but my job is numbers and sometimes numbers are the quickest way to see a worry. And I noticed 2 identical council tax letters in our building's recycling bin with your name spelled 2 different ways." I had not told anyone yet, and here was a neighbor with a lanyard who noticed how names were spelled on envelopes, and she was offering me biscuits and an extra set of eyes. And before I could decide how much to say, she reached into her tote and pulled out a folded piece of paper and said, "I didn't know whether to bring this, but I think it came to my box by mistake a few weeks ago because our numbers are similar and I was away with my mother and only just caught up, and when I saw your name I meant to slide it under your door, Elena, but then I thought, no, better to hand it to her," and she put into my hand a crumpled appointment card from a private clinic across town, with capacity assessment review scrawled in a receptionist's hurried hand and my name spelled correctly, and the appointment date was in 3 days. I looked at Mira and saw that she was the sort of person who notices what others toss away and keeps quiet until the moment it matters, which is a kind of courage I have always trusted more than speeches. And I felt the shift you feel when the tide turns inside you without fanfare, because if someone else had seen and kept and now brought me a vital piece of paper, then perhaps I was not walking into this alone, and I did something I had not done in years, which was to ask for a small favor, without varnish. "Mira," I said, and I heard Tomas in my voice somehow, "would you have 10 minutes to sit with me and look at a few things, just to see if I'm imagining patterns where there are none? Because I've just heard something I can't unhear, and I need to decide how to move next without missing anything important." Mira nodded once, as if she had been waiting to be asked, and she stepped inside and closed the door behind her with the quietness of someone who has closed many doors in her life without slamming them. And when she set the biscuits down, she took out a pen from her lanyard and said, 10 minutes, and then as long as you need. And if this is what I think it is, I know a law clinic that will speak to you without fuss, because sometimes the person who helps is the person who has been arranging the furniture behind your back, and figures don't lie if you line them up slowly. I passed her the letter from the GP and the gray folder and the little envelope with Tomas's key, and for the first time since the message, I felt the solid satisfaction of a plan begin to take shape. But before we could start, there was a chime from my phone on the table, a new message from Daniel popping up above the last one with his photo smiling as if the past hour hadn't changed the angle of the floor, and the preview line said, "Mum, great news about Monday. I'll pick you up," and my hands went still because the cliff I had been walking toward had just shown me its edge clearly, and it was closer than I had told myself it was. Mira sat with me at the table, and we worked in the quiet, practical way that calms the blood after a shock, spreading the papers in a tidy fan and listing what we knew and what we could test without alerting anyone. And her pen moved with the brisk economy of someone used to reconciling accounts against a deadline, while my fingers traced the edge of Tomas's key. And when we had a plan that felt respectable rather than theatrical, she offered to call the GP practice from her phone on speaker so that if the receptionist attempted to route the call to a nominated representative, we would hear the script. And when the receptionist picked up and asked for my date of birth, and then asked if I minded that notes would be shared with my representative, Mira stepped in with a patient steadiness and said that for the avoidance of doubt there was no representative and that any previous note of consent should be treated as disputed until I came in, and there was a pause and a click of keys, and the receptionist said there was a scanned form on the file that looked like my signature, but the witness line was blank, which was irregular, and she thanked us for flagging it and said she would place a hold on any third-party access until Monday. And the moment she said that, a little of the pressure behind my eyes eased, because it proved the pattern wasn't imaginative embroidery, it was fabric on the table. When Mira left, she took nothing but her pen and my gratitude tucked into the kind of silence that friends grow out of brief neighbors. And once the door closed, I sent Daniel a message saying that Monday worked for me and that I was grateful for his help. And although the words tasted like grit, I delivered them with the voice of a mother who felt small and tired, because for this to work I needed him to trust the picture he had drawn of me rather than the person I actually am. And in reply he sent a string of affectionate assurances and a suggestion that he pick up my post that afternoon because he would be nearby, and I wrote back that the concierge had it in hand and that he shouldn't fuss. Then I powered off my phone so that I would not be tempted to read the dots of his typing as if they were weather. I walked down to the lobby to speak to the concierge and found his teenage nephew sitting the desk while the man himself was on a break, and the boy, who loves football and uses the sign-in book as a coaster when he thinks no one is looking, brightened at the chance to be useful and told me that Daniel had asked about registered letters twice this month and had signed for one because the postman had come when I was out, and he tapped the book with a bitten thumbnail as he pointed to the day. And there was my name with Daniel's signature next to it, and a scribble in the parcel column that looked like 2 initials and a string of numbers. And when I asked if I could photograph the page for my records, he agreed without seeing any harm, and then cringed and asked me not to mention it to his uncle, because he would be told off for being lax. And I thanked him and felt the odd steadiness that comes when the ground is no longer trying to tilt under your feet because the facts are starting to fasten themselves to dates and times. Mira had mentioned a law clinic that met in a community hall on Wednesdays, and it happened to be Wednesday. So I took a bus across town and sat beneath a poster about housing benefits while a volunteer solicitor with kind eyes and a haircut that said he had stopped paying for style when his first child was born walked me through the basic protections that exist for people in my position, and he explained with calm clarity that without a registered lasting power of attorney, no one could make decisions about my property or finances unless a court appointed a deputy, and that any doctor assessing capacity for a lasting power must confirm that the signer understood the nature and effect of the document, and that if I suspected someone was moving to engineer a finding of incapacity for convenience, it would be wise to attend any appointment with a neutral support person or, if that was not possible, to record what was said in a contemporaneous note. And he told me that banks have vulnerability protocols, but those can be misused by relatives who present themselves as carers. And he advised me to preempt that by visiting my branch in person with identification, to add a verbal password and a note that no changes were to be made without me present. And he said this all in the same tone he would use to describe the rules of a card game so that none of it felt ominous or theatrical, only orderly and achievable. I walked from the clinic to my bank and took a numbered ticket and sat between a young man arguing about a transfer fee and a woman explaining on the phone that her ex had taken his name off a joint account without telling her. And the queue moved as queues do, and when I finally sat across from the woman at the desk, I answered her questions in the composed tone that has always helped me secure outcomes without turning the interaction into performance. And I asked to place a vulnerability note on my account that no changes could be made without my physical presence, and that any third-party authority requests were to be refused. And the woman typed and nodded and clicked into a screen I couldn't see, and then frowned and excused herself to fetch a supervisor. And the supervisor waved me into a little glass-walled room where clients are taken when something is delicate, and he placed a sheet of paper in front of me that recorded a recent request for a third-party mandate in favor of my son, supported by a photocopy of my passport and a signature that matched mine with a degree of accuracy that made my throat tighten. And he said that the request had been flagged because the photocopy of the passport had a faint gray line running through the machine-readable zone, which sometimes indicates a scan of a scan. And that the bank had tried to call me, but the number on file for me at the time was different, and I gave him my actual number and my verbal password and thanked him for his caution and asked for a printout of the record for my files, and he obliged without fuss and, before I left, suggested I might like to turn off paperless statements for a while. When I got home, there was a WhatsApp message waiting from Layla, bright with emojis and affections, inviting me to a family dinner on Sunday because she had always wanted to cook a proper tagine for me and because she and Daniel had news to share. And I told myself that if there was going to be a public test of my face, it might as well be in their kitchen where I could learn how deep the plan went, and I accepted with thanks and an offer to bring dessert, which she waved away with exaggerated horror at the thought of me carrying anything heavy, and I heard the subtext of the performance, but I made myself read it as kindness, because that is how they needed me to read it if they were to relax their guard. On Thursday morning, I took the early bus to the solicitor's office named on the old envelope from the wills and asked at reception whether Eleanor Marr still worked there, and the woman behind the desk, who wore a cardigan the color of smoke and gave off the efficient calm peculiar to long-serving receptionists, told me that Eleanor had moved to a smaller practice across the river 5 years earlier, and she wrote down the address and, with a glance that said she understood more than she asked, offered to email Eleanor to say I would be calling. And by the afternoon, I was sitting in another small meeting room across another small table, and Eleanor looked older and warmer, and she remembered Tomas's fondness for making lists, and she remembered that I had brought a thermos of tea to our original appointment, because I had refused to pay £2 for their machine coffee, and we smiled ruefully at each other as women who have lived long enough to know that such details matter, and then we set aside the reminiscence and got to the bones. And I showed her the will and the bank printout and the GP letter, and she listened without interrupting, and then she took out a blank pad and said she wanted to make a schedule of events and a list of assets and a plan for the next 7 days that would minimize surprises. We listed the flat, the accounts, the modest life insurance payout that had come when Tomas died, and the small regular donation to his community chorus that he had asked me to keep up because it made him happy even after his death. And at the end of the list, Eleanor asked if there was anything else, and I told her about Tomas's key and his note and the way it had been taped beneath the radiator. And she regarded me for a long second and then asked whether Tomas had ever mentioned a safe deposit box or a locker, and I said that he had, once, in the context of not keeping everything in one place, and she suggested that we visit the 2 most likely banks and ask whether a box existed in his name or mine, and that we take the key and our identification and not mention the message from Daniel, and she offered to come with me to give the matter a formal air and to ensure the bank staff did not fob me off with generic answers. And I felt the relief that comes when a problem is treated as an ordinary matter of procedure rather than a melodrama, because then it can be solved in steps. The first bank had no record of a box, but the second, a smaller branch with brass railings and a faint smell of furniture polish that reminded me of the school's prize room, confirmed that a safe deposit box existed in both our names. And the clerk looked surprised that it had not been accessed in years and asked politely whether Tomas had died recently and offered his condolences when I said it had been 4 years, and he asked me to sign and to produce the key and then led us to a small private booth where he set the box on the table and withdrew to give us privacy, and when I lifted the lid there was no jewel-like drama, only the plain practical things that meant everything to me in that moment. A certified copy of our will, a slim notebook in Tomas's hand that itemized the serial numbers of our larger appliances and the dates of purchase, a photograph of Daniel at 10 with a missing front tooth pressed thin by time, and, beneath those, a sealed envelope with my name in Tomas's block letters and a second key taped to the front of it and a line that read "Copy held with Eleanor." And I looked at Eleanor, and she looked at me, and we both understood that this was the man we had loved and worked with, moving his hand from the past into the present to steady us both. And when I opened the envelope, I found a handwritten letter that said plain things in plain language about the possibility that someone might one day test my boundaries, and that in such a case I should remember that the flat was safe and that the accounts were mine, and that any attempt to move me should be met first with calm questions and then with professional help. And at the end of the letter, he had written the names of 2 people he trusted. One of them was Eleanor. The other was a retired accountant named Arthur who had helped Tomas set up the chorus's gift aid paperwork and who now lived in a housing association a few streets from mine. We left the bank with the letter and the copy of the will and a feeling between us like a handshake with a dead man who had anticipated this fork in the road and laid down breadcrumbs, and Eleanor insisted on scanning the letter and adding it to a file. And she drafted a brief letter on her headed paper addressed to my GP confirming that I had sought legal advice regarding any documents that might affect my property or finances and asking that no third party be permitted to act on my behalf without a court order, and she prepared a second letter to the bank that placed them on notice in more formal language than mine had achieved earlier. And she told me that if Daniel or Layla were to approach me with papers, I should take them and say I needed time to read and that I should not sign in their presence, no matter how casual the setting. And she said she would be available on Monday if I needed her at the clinic, and she passed me the name of a social worker in the adult safeguarding team who could be asked to attend if matters became heated. On Friday morning, I went to the market early to avoid running into Layla by the organic stall, and was nonetheless intercepted by a neighbor from the second floor who enjoys other people's business like a hobby and who leaned in to ask, syrupy with concern, whether it was true that I would be moving to a place with a garden because she had heard Daniel tell the delivery courier on the stairs that the flat would be redecorated soon for an open day, and I smiled and said that rumors are plants that grow in any weather, and that I would let her know if I needed recommendations for a painter. And as I walked away with my carrots and bread, I felt the little humiliation of being discussed in corridors as if I were already poised on a dolly waiting to be wheeled out, and I let the shame pass through and out because shame is not a plan and plans were what I had. On Saturday, I attended the community chorus rehearsal because it is what Tomas would have wanted and because being in a room where other people are busy with a score focuses the mind on time and sequence. And during the break, a woman I know only to nod came to me with a folded flyer she had found pinned to the church notice board, and she said she had thought of me because it was an advertisement for a capacity and care seminar hosted by the very clinic named on my appointment card, and in a corner of the flyer there was a note that attendees would receive priority booking for assessments required to accompany certain legal applications. And the flyer had Layla's handwriting on the back because she had noted a recipe on the blank space and then used the paper as a bookmark, which suggests that she had been at the seminar or had been handed the flyer by someone who had. And in that moment the scale of their preparation lodged in my ribs like a stitch, and I folded the flyer and put it with the others and reminded myself that preparing is not the same as succeeding. Sunday dinner at Daniel and Layla's was an exercise in the kind of theater I used to watch in the school hall when the 7-year-olds performed plays where everyone had 2 lines and the real work happened backstage. And when I arrived, Layla placed a glass of juice in my hand and told me there was no need to take my shoes off, and Daniel fussed with the thermostat and commented on the weather, and their daughter ran in circles with a plastic crown on her head and asked if I could stay the night because she loved my bedtime stories, and I held her and told her we would read next time, and she darted away, and the room settled into the meal. And between servings, Layla asked honeyed questions about whether the flat felt drafty and whether the stairs were still manageable and whether I had ever thought of somewhere with a lift. And I answered with the gentle, non-committal phrases of a woman accustomed to being surveyed, and I placed a slow question into the stream about the GP appointment and whether it was necessary because I felt fine, and Daniel hesitated a fraction and then performed concern beautifully, talking about baseline screenings and the importance of being ahead of worries. And when I asked whether they had spoken to my doctor without me, he looked wounded and said he would never do that, but that the receptionist had called him because he was listed as my point of contact and he hadn't wanted to bother me with details. And I smiled and cut my food and did not ask him to repeat the lie because I needed it to stand untested for now. After dessert, Layla made a show of clearing the plates while glancing at her phone and then, as if remembering something trivial, she pulled a small folder from a sideboard and said that since we were all together it might be convenient to sign a simple form that would allow her to collect prescriptions for me more easily. And she presented a page with a heading that referred to authority to discuss medications, and at the bottom of the page there was a section that went further than prescriptions into consent to share all health information and to make decisions in my best interests should I be unable. And I laughed softly at myself as if cutely embarrassed to be such a bother, and asked whether I might take it home to read with my glasses because my eyes get tired in the evening. And Layla's eyes flashed with a tiny irritation that she smothered under a smile, and she said of course, because it was only a formality and because she trusted me to be sensible, and Daniel stroked my shoulder in a way that would have comforted me last year and now made my skin feel like it didn't belong to me, and I put the folder in my bag and kissed my granddaughter goodnight and let them see me to the door like a person who needs shepherding. When I got home and took out the folder, I found that the single page was in fact a set of 3, with the top sheet modest and the 2 beneath more ambitious. One of them a draft of a health and welfare power of attorney that left the certificate provider line blank, and the other a covering letter from the clinic suggesting that the doctor could sign as certificate provider if I wished. And the clinic's letterhead included the same initials that had appeared in the concierge's book when Daniel signed for the registered letter, and I stood in my kitchen with the tidy stack of papers and felt briefly that old tiredness of being the only adult in a room where jokes are being played. And then I put the papers in the gray folder and wrote a note to myself to scan them with Eleanor on Monday. Monday morning came like a deadline rather than a day, and Daniel arrived early with a tenderness that would have charmed a stranger, and he insisted on driving me because parking at the clinic was difficult and because he had taken the morning off just for me. And I took my handbag, heavier than usual with documents and a notebook and Tomas's letter, and I texted Mira a small apple emoji as we had arranged to signal that I was leaving, and when we arrived at the clinic reception, Layla was already there with a clipboard and a pen, and an effortlessly bright hello and a comment about how well I looked, which, delivered in the gleaming light of the lobby, felt like a sentence thrown from a stage. And the receptionist asked me to sign a consent to share assessment results with my nominated representative, and I asked with innocent slowness whether that was necessary and whether I could simply have a copy for myself and bring it to my solicitor. And there was a flicker across Layla's face that looked like a calculation, and she squeezed the strap of her handbag a fraction harder, and Daniel made a soft noise to signal disappointment in advance of any refusal. And I smiled and signed only the form consenting to my own copy, and we were shown into a room with a potted plant and 2 chairs and a doctor with practiced warmth who introduced himself and asked how I was feeling and whether I knew why I was there. And I said I understood that this was a baseline assessment and that I had brought identification and a note from my solicitor, and I placed Eleanor's letter on the table like a small flag, and I watched a shift behind the doctor's eyes as he took in that this would not be the simplest of mornings. The assessment itself was unthreatening in content, but full of small traps in expectation. And when the doctor asked if anyone helped me with my finances, I answered plainly that I handled them myself and that I had always been responsible for them in my household. And when he asked whether anyone had suggested I move into different housing, I said that there had been discussions, but that I was comfortable where I was, and that I understood my rights regarding my property, and when he asked me to remember 3 words and repeat them later, I did so without show, and when he asked about the date, I gave it precisely, and when he asked about the name of the clinic, I asked him to spell it for my notes. And as I answered, I watched Daniel's knee bounce and Layla's left eyelid twitch, and I thought of all the times I had sat across a parent at school and watched the same tells when we came to the part of the meeting where the truth would not line up neatly with the story they had prepared. And when the doctor finished, he said that he saw no concerns today that would support any finding of incapacity, and that any future concerns should be raised with me in the first instance. And he handed me a copy of the summary, and I thanked him for his time. And as we rose, a nurse poked her head round the door and said there was a call for Dr. Archer from a Mr. Patel at the law clinic, and I kept my face still because Mira had said she would check in with the clinic later to ensure no certificate was issued by mistake, and the doctor nodded and excused himself, and we were guided out to the lobby. Daniel drove in silence, and then, as if a switch had been pressed, he brightened and suggested we stop for coffee and a pastry. And I said I had errands to run because a parcel was being redelivered to my building, and he dropped me quickly with a thin smile that had lost its softness. And when I stepped into the lobby, the concierge waved me over with the urgent cheer of someone who has been holding on to information for the person it belongs to, and he handed me a card from an estate agency with a handwritten note confirming an appointment for evaluation of my flat the following afternoon at 2, signed by a woman named Sammy who had left leaflets in our building before. And beneath the card lay a crisp letter on thick paper from a firm of conveyancers addressed to me at the correct flat number, but delivered in a shared building envelope. And when I opened it with the edge of my key, I found a client care pack with my name printed at the top and a welcome paragraph thanking me for instructing them to handle the transfer of equity of my property to joint names with my son, and a list of items required including my identification and proof of address, and a completed property information form. And at the bottom of the letter there was a reference number and a note that they had already requested the title documents from the land registry, and the date on the letter was 2 days ago. I sat on the lobby bench with the conveyancer's letter open on my knees until the concierge finished signing in a courier, and when he came over I asked whether anyone had spoken to him about a viewing in my flat. And he said that a woman had called yesterday to check parking for an evaluation team, and that she had given my name confidently, which had sounded odd to him because owners usually make those calls themselves. And he wrote the time down on a slip of paper and said he would be on shift at 2 if I wanted him nearby. I took the lift upstairs and put the kettle on because I work best when there is a fixed sequence to the next hour, and while the water heated I called Eleanor on speaker and read her the letter from the conveyancers slowly, punctuation included. She asked me not to reply to the firm directly yet, then told me to forward a scan of the letter and the valuation card to her secure email, and to save the envelopes for postmarks. When I mentioned the concierge's book entry with Daniel's signature for a registered item last week, she asked for that photo too. Then paused and said she would lodge a priority note with the land registry to place a restriction on the title so that no transfer or new charge could be registered without a conveyancer's certificate confirming my consent. She explained it in simple steps so that my head could hold it. She would file an RX-1 for a standard owner's restriction and, given the circumstances, also a form to add a caution against dealings. I wrote RX1 in my notebook with the time of our call and underlined it twice, not because I am sentimental but because writing the letters made the protection feel real. I left my phone face down on the table and went to the bedroom to check the gray folder again. The will was there, the bank printout was there, Tomas's letter was there, and beneath them the clinic flyers Mira had brought and the draft power of attorney papers from Layla's folder. I added the conveyancer's pack to the stack, then made a second copy set and sealed it in a large brown envelope with a note for Mira in case I needed someone to fetch it quickly. I pulled Tomas's key from my cardigan pocket and tried it against the small fireproof cash box we keep at the back of the wardrobe. It didn't fit, which I already knew, but testing it steadied me. On my way back to the kitchen my phone buzzed. It was a new email from the estate agent address on the card. Dear Ms., confirming tomorrow's appraisal at 1400 hours, as requested by your representative, Mr. Daniel H. He advised us you have been feeling overwhelmed and that he will attend in your stead. We will require access to review storage and meter cupboards. I read it twice and then pressed forward to view the email chain. 2 earlier messages were from Layla, not Daniel, using her work email with her signature block removed in the replies, giving the concierge's first name as if they were old friends and asking for a discreet approach because I become anxious when surprised. I printed the thread and wrote today's date on top. At 11 I put on my coat and walked to the branch library where there is a scanner that works without fuss. I scanned everything new to my thumb drive and sent the files to Eleanor with a short list of attachments. When I left the library, there was a missed call from a blocked number and a voicemail from Sammy at Amber & Company, the agent on the card, saying that as a courtesy she always confirms with the title holder directly and could I please call her back to verify access. I stood on the pavement where I could hear clearly and called her, and when she asked the standard security questions I answered, and then asked whether Daniel had produced any authority to instruct on my behalf. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then said he had mentioned a capacity letter and a pending power of attorney, and that while they do not police family arrangements they are careful when owners are older, so she had booked it subject to my confirmation. I thanked her for the caution and said calmly that no one but me may authorize entry to my home, and that if she wished to proceed with evaluation it must be expressly at my instruction with me present, and that a copy of any notes taken should be sent to me afterward. She agreed without argument and, after a pause, volunteered that the caller had insisted on the earliest slot because the decorators are scheduled, which she admitted sounded premature. Before hanging up, she offered to forward her call log and the incoming numbers. I accepted and saved her email the moment it came through. Back at home, I phoned the adult safeguarding line Eleanor had given me and explained that I felt pressured by relatives to sign legal documents and that there had been attempts to act as if I had already agreed. I told the duty officer I did not require a visit yet, but wanted the situation noted. She asked methodical questions and assigned a reference number. And when we ended, I wrote the number on a yellow sticky note and stuck it to the back of my front door where only I would see it if things turned noisy. I placed a small voice recorder Mira had lent me on the bookshelf in the hall and checked that its light blinked when I tapped it. Then I went over the flat for anything they might use or claim and took photographs, meter readings, the condition of my kitchen cabinets, the contents of the hall cupboard. It felt excessive until I remembered the registered letter Daniel had signed for and the wrong flat number on the G-piece letter. Small inaccuracies accumulate until they form a story you didn't write. Just after 1, Mira knocked lightly and stepped in with her tote and a calm expression that did more for me than any speech could. She put her phone on the table and opened a note where she had listed the times of every call she had overheard in the lobby that could be related, including Daniel's inquiries about title searches using a different surname spelling for me. I didn't want to interfere, she said, arranging the pages, but the detail bothered me, and sometimes a wrong letter makes a search return no results, which can be useful to someone trying to slow you down while they speed up. I nodded and poured her tea, and when the kettle clicked, she looked at me over the steam and said, "Would you like company when the valuers arrive?" Not as a participant. As a person who happens to be here making tea. I did. I wanted a witness who was neither family nor paid to be there. At 2:05, the intercom buzzed and the concierge's voice came through. The agent team had arrived with a clipboard and tape measure, and Daniel was with them although he had not signed in, but the concierge had kept him there with a question about parking. I asked him to send up the agents alone first and to let Daniel know I would be 5 minutes and that he should wait in the lobby. The 2 women from Amber and Company came up with their trolley bag and paused at the door when they saw both me and Mira and the recorder on the shelf. I welcomed them into the hall and asked to see their identification. They obliged without fuss, and I showed them the kitchen, the bedrooms, and the meter cupboard, answering their measurements politely while Mira offered tea. When one of them asked whether I planned to sell, I said simply that I was gathering information and that any decision was mine. She nodded and did not press. As they finished in the living room, there was a heavy step on the stairs and Daniel's voice outside calling my name, warmer than it had been in weeks and pitched to sound light. I opened the door before he could knock too hard and stood in the frame so he could not enter without brushing past me. "You didn't answer my text," he said, smiling with effort. "I thought I'd help with the valuation. You know how these things can be confusing." I held his look and replied, "I asked them here." "I am not confused. We are finished shortly, then I have an appointment. You may wait downstairs if you like." His face changed in a small way I used to miss when he was a boy. The politeness shut down a notch. He craned to see past me and then leaned closer. "Mom, this resistance isn't good for you. Layla and I have been trying to make this smooth. If you start making officials nervous, they will involve people you don't want." I let that hang and then said in the same steady tone I reserve for difficult cashiers, "Officials are already involved, Daniel. The GP has corrected the record. My bank has notes on my account. A solicitor has written to the clinic. If you have a document you wish to show me, you may hand it to me now. Otherwise, you will wait downstairs until the valuers leave." He swallowed, produced nothing, and turned on his heel with a tight nod that sat oddly with the smile he pasted back on as the agents walked out. In the lift, I heard him tell them he would call their office later to compare figures. I closed my door and locked it out of habit, and because habit is one of the few honest reasons to lock a door. As soon as we were alone, Mira sat and exhaled in a way that told me her muscles had been braced the whole time. "He wanted to be in the room when numbers were said out loud," she said, "so he could steer them. He's not used to you answering like that." I felt it in my chest too, the strain of speaking without being drawn into the old pattern, and I wrote down the time and what he had said about officials. Then I phoned Eleanor and gave her a summary, and she said she had already received automated confirmation from the land registry that the restriction application had been logged and that any pending application would now trigger a referral to me. She suggested I visit the branch office of my building's management to request copies of the sign-in logs for the past month, and she would send a courier for my originals so I would not need to carry them around. At 4, as I was washing 2 mugs at the sink, my email pinged. It was from the Land Registry Property Alert Service. Eleanor had set it up that morning. The subject line was plain: Alert. Application received affecting title, number. The body said an application had been lodged to register a transfer and a restriction, and that if I had not authorized the change, I should contact them or my conveyancer. I stared at the screen until the letters fixed themselves in my head. Someone had moved already, likely using the old will copy or the conveyancer's pack, hoping to get in ahead of the restriction. I forwarded the alert to Eleanor and, before I could lower the phone, a second email arrived. This one from Sammy at Amber & Company, forwarding me a voicemail transcription from an hour earlier. It was Daniel requesting her to email the draft valuation to our conveyancers and giving them the same reference number that appeared on my letter. I called Eleanor and found her already speaking to the land registry caseworker. She clicked me into the call and introduced me. The caseworker was calm and asked me to confirm that I did not consent to any transfer or additional owner and that I had not signed any TR1 or deed of gift. I confirmed out loud that there was no consent. The caseworker said the application would be marked as requiring evidence and that the restriction filing would likely overtake it in processing order. When we ended the call, I sat down and felt my hands trying to shake. Mira put her cup in the sink and came back with a sheet from her tote. It was a printout from her office's address verification software. She had run my name informally, and the system showed my GP file had been changed to list a nominated representative 2 weeks ago and then changed again this morning to none. They're quick, she said, but not quicker than the notes now in your file. I thanked her without pretty words. There was nothing pretty here. I decided I would not spend the evening inside waiting to jump at footsteps. I took a folder with the minimum I needed, left the recorder in place, locked the door, and went downstairs with Mira. At the concierge desk, his nephew sat with headphones around his neck and straightened when he saw me. He apologized quickly for ever letting Daniel sign on my behalf, then said there had been a second registered item today, delivered while the valuation team was upstairs. He handed me the slip. The sender was the conveyancing firm whose letter I had received. I took the lift back up alone to fetch it from my letterbox while Mira waited in the lobby. In the hall, I slit the envelope with my key and slid out a set of forms and a cover letter. The forms were TR1 transfer documents with my name and Daniel's typed in, and the signature line for the transfer was blank except for a faint gray shadow in the shape of my name, like a tracing. There were also 2 witness lines already filled out with printed names I did not recognize. The cover letter thanked me for returning our call and confirmed they would be sending a courier in the morning for my signature. I carried the papers into the kitchen and laid them flat, photographing each page with my phone, then put them into a plastic sleeve without marking them. I texted the photos to Eleanor and phoned her. She picked up on the first ring. She told me to place the forms into a clean envelope and to write on the outside that they had been received unrequested and unsigned, and that no consent would be given, and to bring the envelope to her office first thing. She also said, in the measured voice of a person who has sat with many frightened people, that the shadow of my signature could be evidence of a digital lift from an earlier scan, and that she would arrange a document examiner if needed. At 6:30, my phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. We need to talk tonight. Stop letting outsiders confuse you. A second later, the intercom sounded with the concierge's quiet voice, less steady than before. Ms. Elena, I'm sorry to disturb you, but your son is here and he has a locksmith with him saying you asked for a lock change. I have not let them up. Should I call someone? I looked at the sealed envelope on my table and the recorder's red blink and Tomas's key beside it, and the decision I had danced around all day settled into a single action that felt like stepping across a painted line. Yes, I said into the handset, please call the police and tell them there is an attempt to gain access without consent, and tell Daniel that I have documents he will want to see, but not in the hallway. As I set the receiver back into its cradle, there was a knock at my door from the internal stairs, not the lobby entrance, and Layla's voice, smooth and cheerful, floated through the wood asking whether I needed help with the lock because Daniel had told her I was frightened of being alone. The knock came again, quicker this time, and behind it, lower, I heard Daniel ask if I really wanted to make this ugly in front of the neighbors. The day of the christening arrived, and I was already on edge from the moment I woke up. I had ironed my dress 3 times, checked my handbag twice, and still felt like I was forgetting something important. It was not about the clothes or the gift I was bringing. It was about what I carried inside me, the recordings, the documents, and the quiet determination that had been building for weeks. The church was full of neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances, all gathered to celebrate the baby, but I knew this day would not end the way my son and his wife imagined. I sat in the front row with my grandson at my side, my hands folded over my lap to hide the slight tremble. Sophia had chosen a pale blue dress that looked more suited to a gala than a baptism, and she moved about like the hostess of a society event, not a mother celebrating her child. She leaned down to greet guests with exaggerated warmth, her eyes flicking constantly toward Richard, the tall man I had seen at the funeral months earlier, the same one I now knew had been her lover and partner in her schemes. Their closeness was clear to anyone who paid attention, but most people were too polite or too blind to question it. When Thomas, James's old friend and lawyer, entered the church, Sophia's face tightened for a second before she smoothed it over with another practiced smile. After the service, the reception began in the parish hall. Round tables were covered with flowers and cakes, the sound of chatter and clinking glasses filling the room. Sophia stood near the center, Lucas at her side, accepting congratulations like a queen on her throne. That was when I made my move. I tapped my glass, my voice carrying further than I expected when I said that I wanted to say a few words for my grandson. The hall fell quiet, people turning to face me. Sophia's smile faltered, and my son's friends looked at each other with curiosity. I began by thanking everyone for being there, for supporting Lucas, for honoring James's memory. Then I paused, let the silence settle, and continued in a tone that was calm but firm. I said there were truths that needed to be spoken, truths James had anticipated before his passing. At that, I pulled the small recorder from my bag, the same one that had captured my son's words meant only for his wife, words that revealed her contempt for me and her plans to take control of everything James had built. Gasps echoed through the hall as his voice filled the room, clear and undeniable. Sophia froze, her hand tightening on Lucas's shoulder until he winced and pulled away. Before she could speak, Thomas stepped forward, holding up a folder. He said that James had updated his will shortly before his death, and that the new version, which Sophia had never wanted anyone to see, changed everything. Lucas's guardianship was entrusted to me, not his mother, with clear conditions attached. The property Sophia had been trying to sell was locked in a trust, untouchable without my consent. The partnership with Richard was revealed as fraudulent, with documents showing how Sophia had planned to siphon money through false investments. The room buzzed with whispers, people exchanging shocked looks, some even shaking their heads in disbelief. Sophia tried to laugh, to dismiss it all as forged or exaggerated, but then Richard, pale and sweating, muttered that he would not go down with her and admitted enough to make everyone understand that the scheme was real. That was the moment the crowd turned. Neighbors who once admired her style now avoided her gaze, relatives who had whispered in her favor pulled back. Lucas clung to me, whispering if it was true that his father had known. I bent down and told him yes, his father had thought of him until the very end, and had made sure he would be safe. The silence after that was heavier than the loudest accusation. Sophia's face drained of color as she realized she had lost, not just her reputation but her control, her comfort, her power. Thomas's voice carried one last time, reminding everyone that James's last will and testament would now be enacted under the supervision of the court, and that attempts to challenge it would only bring more shame. I watched Sophia glance around the hall, her eyes desperate for an ally, but no one stepped forward. Even my son's old colleagues, who once tolerated her presence, turned away. The priest, who had tried to remain neutral until that point, cleared his throat and asked for calm, but it was too late. The truth was out, and nothing could cover it again. The christening that was supposed to cement Sophia's position had become her downfall, and I had made sure of it. At that moment, when every eye was on her, when silence pressed down like a weight, I knew we had reached the edge of something final. But what came next would decide everything, not just for her, but for Lucas and for me. The priest's attempt to restore order failed because the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth that had just been spoken aloud. Sophia stood there, her face stiff, her hands trembling as she clutched her glass, and her silence spoke louder than any denial could. She knew she could not sweep it away. Richard avoided her eyes, already shrinking from the weight of his own words, while the neighbors whispered behind their hands, some staring openly, others shifting uncomfortably at the thought of how close they had once been to her. I felt Lucas lean into me, not in confusion, but in recognition that the tide had turned, and he was no longer alone in the dark shadow his mother had tried to cast over him. Thomas laid the documents flat on the table for anyone who wanted to see them. Several relatives came forward, reading with wide eyes, shaking their heads as the clauses became clear, the guardianship, the trust, the safeguards James had set in place. I did not gloat. I kept my hands steady on Lucas's shoulders and let others weigh the evidence. My son's voice in the recording still echoed in the room, a reminder of contempt too sharp to ignore. When Sophia tried to step forward and speak, her words cracked. She began by saying she had only ever wanted the best for Lucas, but the murmur of the crowd cut her off. Someone whispered too loudly, she wanted the flat, and laughter followed, harsh and short. That finished her. Richard slipped out quietly, and no one stopped him. Sophia, realizing she had no ground left, put down her glass with exaggerated care and announced she needed air. She walked toward the door, her back straighter than her eyes betrayed, and no one moved to follow. The priest cleared his throat again, but found no words. I guided Lucas to a chair, and Thomas leaned close to me. This was decisive, he said quietly. She could not contest it without incriminating herself further. The community heard everything, and the recording ensures no one can claim exaggeration. I nodded, feeling the fatigue seep into me, but it was a fatigue that came after action, not before it. The rest of the reception limped along. Conversations picked up again, though in lower voices, circling not around the baby or the service, but around what had just been revealed. Neighbors approached me to squeeze my hand, some apologizing for not having noticed sooner, others thanking me for protecting Lucas. I accepted their words without embellishment because this was never about applause. It was about dignity. When I left with Lucas, people stepped aside, giving us a quiet corridor out. Sophia did not appear again. In the following weeks, the legal machinery moved steadily. The conveyancer's application to register the transfer was rejected, the land registry confirming in writing that no change could proceed without my signature. The bank finalized the fraud report on the attempted mandate, sending me copies for my records. The GP practice issued a formal letter correcting my file and confirming that no representative would be accepted without my presence. The safeguarding officer visited once, sitting with me in my kitchen, noting everything down carefully, and left satisfied that I was not alone in this. Sophia tried one challenge through her lawyer, but the documents and the recording closed that door quickly, and soon she stopped trying. Lucas came to live with me full-time. The court accepted James's updated will and my guardianship without contest, and though the paperwork was thick, the decision was firm. At first, he missed his mother in the restless way children miss even the parent who hurt them, but he settled quickly once he understood that his home was stable, his schooling uninterrupted, and his evenings filled with ordinary routines. I cooked, He did homework at the table, and when he asked questions about his father, I answered truthfully without dramatics. He learned that his father had thought of him until the end, and that gave him a steadiness that no scheme could take away. As for me, I did not return to the silence I had lived in before. I joined the community legal advice group once a week, not as a client, but as a volunteer, sitting beside older neighbors who came in clutching letters they did not understand. I explained clauses, showed them where to sign, where not to, and reminded them to keep their records straight. When I walked home afterward, I passed the church where the christening had collapsed into exposure, and I felt no bitterness, only clarity. Justice had not been abstract, it had been practical, written in ink, spoken in plain words, recorded in sound, and witnessed by many. One evening, while putting away Tomas's letter and the key he had left me, I realized what he had meant by those 6 words, for when they forget who paid. It was not about money alone. It was about remembering that the life I built, the roof I lived under, the dignity I carried, were not gifts to be reassigned by anyone else. They had been earned, maintained, and defended, and when the moment came, I had not been silent. Now, as I close this part of my life and look toward what comes next, I do not ask for admiration. I only know that when someone tries to erase you, the strongest reply is not a raised voice, but a clear record, a steady witness, and the courage to show it at the right time. Lucas sleeps safely in the next room, his school bag ready for the morning. I sit at the same kitchen table where I once listened to a message that tried to reduce me to a package. The difference is that now every piece of paper, every account, every door key answers to me. And that is enough.